In this lesson, we'll start to build the back of the pod itself. So before we do that, let's take a look at our engine. And once you've got your engine done, in any application, it's always a good idea to name your files, name your objects in your scene so that you understand what it is you're looking at. Same thing goes for, if you're working in something like Photoshop, you name your layers. It just helps your life, especially makes your life easier when you start to get a lot of different objects and things in your scene. You want to be able to tell what's what. So you don't want a lot of things that are named either the same, or you don't want a lot of things that are named, something that just doesn't mean anything to you. I don't know whether this is a bolt or, a piece of the a pipe or something like that. So what you want to do is just name things logically according to you. And you can, go with whatever naming convention that you want, but just the naming is important. So let's open up our schematic view, and I'll just shrink it down a little bit. And so you can see I've named a lot of these objects, and so to name these we can just select the object and go in here on the modify panel and just name our object if we want to name those individually. Now we have a lot of objects that might be a little bit hard to name individually just because we have so many of them. So for instance, on the fan, if I choose all of the blades of the fan, you can see that it's going to be kind of a pain to go in and name each individual fan blade. We don't really need to have a lot of differentiation between the names, just kind of the base name and then maybe a number or letter denoting that it's A, B, C, D, and so on. So to make our lives a little bit easier here, we can go into Tools, Rename Objects, and that brings up a dialog where you can actually add a base name and then choose to number those if you want to. You can choose a base number. You can choose a step to go by. So that will make your life a little bit easier as well. We also want to start grouping objects together. So in our schematic view, we want to start grouping things together. You can see I've already done that with the fan. We've got the pipes, we've got the nozzle, we've got the bolts all grouped together. We can also group everything together. So selecting all of these, we can say group those together, and we'll call this something like pod engine. And because we know this is from the driver's point of view, the right hand side, because we've got the fin on the outside, we've got the power coupling in the middle, we can, if we want to, add an RT to the end so we know that that's actually the right hand side. And you can see it drops it underneath that group. That allows us to not have to worry about selecting any of these individual pieces on accident. We can come in and just select the group and now move that around as a group, and we don't have to worry about selecting any of those smaller pieces in the middle. So that's kind of nice. All right, so once we have this all grouped together, we can turn off the visibility of this. So we can use layers if we want, or we can just right click and say hide selection, and there it goes. So now we want to build the back of the pod. So let's start by just bringing in a sphere, and our keyboard entry, I'm just going to put in a radius of about 10, and we'll say create. Go into our modify panel. I think I want to size this up a little bit, so maybe take this up to 12 or so, just depending on what you want to do. I'm going to turn on edged faces here. And so I want a kind of a half sphere with a little bit of detail here in the front. So I'm going to first choose to increase the hemisphere amount, which takes this down. And you can see using the chop, it kind of chops that down, so it's not really keeping the resolution that we have. If we were to change this to a squash, you can see how that tries to keep that resolution. It just changes the shape. So I'm going to bring this up to maybe about 0.6 or so, something like that. Now I also want to add some detail up here, and using slice we can do this. So turn that on, and now we can choose the angle here. So slice from, I actually want to change this to a negative amount because I want to create a gap up here. So if we change this to something like -40, let's say, you can see that we now have a gap between where it starts -40 to 0. If we change this a positive amount, let's say an equal amount, we get something that looks like that. Okay, so we're still working with a primitive, so there's actually a lot we can do here with this primitive. Apart from going in and converting it to an editable poly and modifying it manually, there's a lot of parameters that we can change to get a nice more complex shape at least. Not too complex, but at least it's a better starting point than starting just from a sphere and doing everything manually. Now we also want to change the segments possibly. I want to look at this, and we've got right now 12, and so that puts 6 on either side, and that is actually the right amount for what I want to do here with this back piece. I do want to shape it a little bit, and so to do that we can use an FFD, a freeform deformer, in the modifier list. So we'll add that to our stack, and I'm just going to add a 2x2x2 because we don't need to do a lot of shaping. We'll access the control points, and we'll just select the ones on the back, and let's just stretch it out. So just kind of pull this back so we get something like that. Okay. Once we've got it shaped the way that we want, let's collapse that. Let's convert it to an editable poly. And now that's actually baked down. Now I want to have some detail that's on top of a sort of smoothed version of this. So I'm actually going to duplicate some of these faces. So let's select all of the polygons here. And then I'm just going to alt-click on these to deselect the faces that I don't want. So I'm just going to select the outer shell basically. So I'll deselect anything that's underneath or in front there. Okay. And I also don't need these. So I'll deselect those as well. So these are the polygons that I have selected. Let's now detach those. So we'll find Edit Geometry. We'll detach. We'll create a clone because we don't want to mess with the geometry underneath. We'll just create a clone. And so now we have a new object out here. Okay. So let's work on this object. I want to create these kind of sections here. And so let's select the edges. And actually before we do that, oh, we can actually do this first. We'll select the edges. And so I'm just control clicking and then shift clicking so that we just select those loops. Okay. So control click, shift click, control click and shift click. Okay, so we've got all of those edges selected. Let's chamfer those. And we'll take the value down. So let's take the amount down here. So maybe something like 0.25 maybe. So that we have a little bit of a gap there. Okay. We've got segments in here. You don't want to really add too many segments. So I'm going to leave that at 1. We'll say OK to that. And before we do anything else, I want to add some resolution in here because we're going to be smoothing this out. And so when we smooth objects out, we'll look at this in a minute, the smoothing is actually going to really interpolate between these points. So in order to get sharper edges when you're smoothing, you're going to need more resolution. So in that case, we will go ahead and add a few edge loops here. Let's open up our graphite modeling tools. Okay, let's use Swift Loop and let's add an edge down on the bottom. So something like that. Let's add an edge up at the top. Okay, and now the other edges we can add later on if need be. Now we go to a polygon selection. Okay, and still on this outer shell, we will go ahead and select, just like we did with the edges, we'll now select the loops of polygons. So control click, shift click, control click, shift click. Okay, same thing all the way around. So we get all of those polygons that were once the edges that we selected. So we basically replaced those edges with polygons. Now we can go ahead and delete those. So that gives us just these strips that match up with the shape that we want. Okay, now if we want to maintain the smoothness, we're going to need to do the same thing here. So let's go ahead and get our Swift Loop. And we'll just start adding some resolution in here on the sides in anticipation of our smoothing. Okay, and Swift Loop is just a really a little bit quicker and easier way of adding those edge loops that we looked at. We looked at using Connect. There's also tools, and we have training on some of these graphite modeling tools, but there's Flow Connect, which kind of uses Connect but tries to maintain the shape of the object. So there are several different tools for getting to the same place, just as in most applications. 3ds Max has a lot of modeling tools to get you where you want. So if you don't like a particular tool, don't worry. There's probably one there that you will enjoy a little bit more. Okay, so once we've got all of those, all that detail built in there, now we need to add some thickness. So we can go into our shell, get our shell modifier. Let's add, and we can add a very small inner amount if we want to, but mostly I want to add an outer amount. kind of bring that out. Okay, so we get something like that. Let's add some segments because we also want to add some resolution in here to keep that tightness. So we can add some segments in there. Now to smooth this, there are several ways that we can do this. One of the ways, simple ways, is to add a modifier. So we can add a turbo smooth to this, and there are several smoothing modifiers. We can just add a turbo smooth. You can see that that's pretty smooth, although it's still kind of jagged. So we can take that turbo smooth, raise the number of iterations. You can see it's very smooth, but it's still within the modifier stack. So if we had to, we could turn that off, go down and modify any of these things, come back and turn that on. So using that modifier stack is really a nice way to work. Now, as for this shape in here, if we want to go ahead and smooth this, let's take a look at just adding a turbo smooth to this. You can see how those edges go away, the sharpness of the edges. So this is what I'm talking about when we're talking about adding edges to make things nice and sharp. You can see where this point is nice and sharp, whereas this point is not so much. So that's where you'd want to come in and add, more resolution in here to make that a nice sharp shape. And we could do that just going in. One of the ways that we could try to do this is just to select these polygons rather. So basically everything but the outer shell that we copied. Maybe all of these as well. Okay. We could come in, maybe do an inset. Okay. And we want to do a pretty small inset, maybe 0.1 or so. That would give us a little bit of geometry. It still wouldn't help us with the point. Okay. Let me actually do that again. I don't think we committed that. So make that 0.1. Say OK to that. Okay, now if we add a turbo smooth, it's going to look a little bit sharper. Okay, we can see that. But we can still come in and add some sharpness here by tweaking that, and we'll just turn that off for a second. Look at our editable poly. We can come in and add using Swift Loop. We can add a loop right down here. That'll help us a little bit. Go back and turn that on. We get back to our object. Okay, and so that helps us get kind of a little bit more of a sharper shape. You can see it's because there's only one edge in here, it's curved around at this point. We don't really care about this because we're going to have an object flowing into that. So we can add some color. Let's just add a gray to this and maybe make this a black. So there's a little bit more contrast. And so that's how we can start to get the back end of our pod. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is start to build the base here with a cockpit, so in front of this piece. So we will do that in the next lesson.